Hello again. Today we want to talk about three great philosophers, that is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Of these three, Socrates is the grandpa. Matter of fact, the easiest way to remember these guys is to go SPA, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, SPA. That's the way to remember them. Socrates, like I say, is the grandpa. He comes along in the late 400s, 450 down to 400, right along in there. As such, he sees the fall of Athens, he sees the end of the Peloponnesian War, he sees Athens collapse as a dictator, as a democracy, and a dictatorship, a military dictatorship, take over. That is Sparta. That bothers him. There's a lot of things that bother him. He's famous as a philosopher because he starts asking, what is the nature of truth? What really is true? Can you and I find out what is true? And if so, where do we go to find it? That's his question. He finally he goes around to all the smart guys in town, talks to them, and they don't have the right answers for him. So he goes out to the oracle. I remember oracles in the Greeks. He goes to the oracle and he says, "Who's the smartest guy in town?" The oracle looks at him for a minute and says, "You are." Right. That makes him mad. But he goes back and once again goes around and talks to all the smart people. And the more that he asks questions, the more he realizes that what these people are saying is not true. It's kind of true. And that actually maybe he is the smartest person in town. What he was looking for was truth, the ultimate truth. And he puts truth into two different types. He calls it relative truth and absolute truth. Those are the two. Most of what you and I do on a given day is relative truth. It's a good day, it's a bad day, relative truth. I have a good car, I have a bad car, relative truth. Compared to what, you see? And so he simply says, if I could learn ultimate truth on any different subject, in other words, what's the best kind of car to buy, then I'd never have any problems. If you knew, walking out the door to go shop for a car, which car would give you the best gas mileage, which car would look the best, which car would have the best longevity, which one would go without breaking down for the next 20 years, let's say, you'd say, well, duh, that's the kind of car that I should buy. That works in everything. And so Socrates simply said, let's try to find ultimate truth. The more that he looked, however, the more that he realized that you can't find it, that it's not out there, that most of the things that you and I deal with are simply relative. He almost quotes Christ when he says, remember Christ says, you shall know the truth shall make you free. Socrates says the same thing. He said, if you knew the correct truth, you'd never make a bad mistake. With that in mind, he sets out to discover it. Now, the way that he would talk to a person was one-on-one. He didn't lecture in formal audiences. He didn't get a bunch of people down at the marketplace with 20 people deep standing around him. He'd just simply sit down and start talking to an individual one-on-one, dialogue. And the process is called the Socratic dialogue because it's a process of just two people going back and forth until they discover what really is true. And in that process, he likens it to an onion. He said, if you take an onion and if you start peeling off the layers, what you see looks like an onion, smells like an onion, but it's not quite the same onion we had just a minute ago. And 4 more layers down, you're saying, whoa, this is not quite where we started with. And he says, that's the way the truth is. Truth appears to be one thing, but the more that you dig, the tighter you get in that definition, maybe the less true it actually is. The people that bothered him the most in his day were called sophists, and from our word sophistry. President Hinckley always used to say there is much of sophistry in today's world. Our word philosophy comes from the same root. Sophy just means wisdom, means smarts. So who are the smart people? In today's world, I'd say lawyers. Lawyers are what Socrates hated. And the reason he didn't like them is because they didn't deal in absolute truth, they dealt in relative truth. If you have a client who is guilty of robbing a bank and your job is to get him off, then you go into the courtroom and argue like crazy about everything you can imagine to say he didn't do it, when in fact we know that he did. So what are you saying? Relative truth, not absolute truth. Otherwise you'd stand up and say my client's guilty, end of case. So the sophists are what bothered him. In today's world, almost everything that you and I do is predicated upon the notion that it is true as far as we know it. It's not total truth, it's just truth to a point. The easiest example is science. I was a physics major a long, long time ago, and the book that we had in the inside of the flyleaf the periodic chart printed. The number of elements that were on that chart is not the same number of elements that are on that chart today. Why is that? Because we've discovered some more. So what does that mean? In the day that that book was printed, it was true. It was absolute truth. There are this many elements. This is as much as we know. But the problem is it was as much as we know. It wasn't total truth. It was just as much as. And so I would dare say any science book that is printed today is obsolete the moment it comes off the press. Because even though it contains all truth, it is all truth as we know it, not as is. It's relative truth. That's what bothered him. And so he concludes, reality is nothing really more than what our society tells us that it is. Truth is what your parents tell you that it is. Truth is what the church tells you that it is. The wonderful part about the church is that it deals in absolute truth, while everything around us deals in relative truth. Is there another life? Absolutely. Can you prove that? No, you can't. But is it a fact? Yes. You see how easy that one was? So truth is what he was looking for. Beauty, honor, truth are absolutes. Absolutes. And that's what he was looking for. And so his life was spent searching for meaning, which is above and beyond just the life that you and I have here. What we do today doesn't really count in the long run. How much money's in your bank doesn't count in the long run. What kind of clothes you wear today doesn't really count in the long run. How you style your hair. Look back 40 years, look back 30 years. I mean, remember Farrah Fawcett or somebody like that. You've seen the old TV shows. Back in the big hair days, that was relative. That was beauty, but it was relative beauty then. Look at how hairstyles have changed just in that short time. You can imagine how silly it's going to be when you and I get to heaven and somebody's talking about how nice their car was. They say, hey, what kind of wheels did you have down there? And you'll say, well, I drove a Mercedes or something or other. And they'll say, what's that? Well, it's a car. And they'll say, well, I had an Arsenal Noble IV. And you'll say, what was that? And you say, well, that was the best chariot you could have. See how silly it is? We're talking about two completely separate things, each thinking that it's absolute truth when in fact it's not. Socrates never wrote down a thing. He was just a guy who liked to talk. And he wasn't that, he didn't attract a lot of attention walking down the street. The one definition of him that we have said he was an ugly, snub-nosed little man. That's not going to get you on TV, is it? Be that as it may, one of the smart guys of history. Because he didn't write down anything, it remains to one of his students to do so. That's Plato. Let's talk about Plato next.